of the things that I think makes it seem plausible that Marx has no moral theory is that he certainly does not have the kind of thing that contemporary analytical philosophy tends to consider a moral theory, meaning, there's no kind of abstract principle that sometimes requires the sacrifice of human beings, that human beings sacrifice themselves and their interests to some higher aim. He doesn't offer anything like that. He thinks that the interests of the proletariat are completely coincident with the interests of humanity. And insofar as they are not coincident with the interests of the bourgeoisie, he's just not talking to them. And this is, and so if what we expect to find by way of a moral argument is some kind of abstract principle that any sort of abstract mind contemplating the pure rationality of his arguments can apprehend, regardless of their own material interests, Marx doesn't offer that. And he doesn't even think it's possible. And he does think that anything that masquerades as that is probably concealing a certain set of material interests, namely that of the bourgeoisie. But if we take a more expansive view of what it means to think ethically, then we could bring Aristotle into the conversation. We can bring a kind of lineage of ethical thought that has some connections with, some conversations with virtue ethics, where the thought for Marx is that human beings are essentially beings who produce themselves by interacting with their environment in order to satisfy their needs. That's what it is to be a human being. It's why I center labor in the book, because labor is that, or Marx sometimes calls it human self-changing. Now, of course, human beings change themselves in all kinds of ways. And so the question is, great, you've explained that human beings change themselves. Awesome. What am I supposed to do with that? But I think there's then a question of what kinds of circumstances are conducive to human beings expressing that essence. What kind of circumstances are conducive to human beings even being around to interact with the world and with their own development in that way? And so that Marx thinks that constitutes some of the building blocks of an argument for communism as the circumstances in which that essence can be expressed in a concrete, objective way in human beings consciously taking up their own development as a species and their survival as a species as their own conscious end. And I'll add to this that that ultimately what Marx is putting forward is a theory of human survival, of human being, when in those initial lines of the critique of the German ideology, where Marx and Engels say that the premise is men, or human beings, we can say, right? That the premise is human beings. Actually, the German word there probably is Menschen, I would guess. Right. I don't recall, right? But is human beings interacting with the world in order to satisfy their needs. What he's talking about is humans surviving, trying to survive. That is the premise. And communism, the most important argument for communism is that it is the only way that human beings can survive, that we can transcend these destructive circumstances in which we live. Now, if you're not interested in human survival, if it doesn't matter to you, I don't mean you personally, Ben, but like if you're the sort of but if you're the sort of person, I'm for it too. I'm like yay, but if you're the sort of person who is just indifferent to whether or not human beings survive, then then in fact I don't think that Marxist theory is for you. Right, sure. Maybe there's something, so it does kind of take that as a premise that you're engaged, in this human endeavor of surviving, of living, right, of flourishing, but it doesn't call on you to sort of sacrifice that aim or to subordinate it to some principle that's higher than human survival, or that doesn't exist.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really helpful. And kind of at the beginning of that, you contrasted like the way you think that Marx is thinking about ethics, or the implicit ethical vision in a lot of what Marx says, with the way that people typically think about ethics in the context of analytic philosophy. And I think here of like G.A. Cohen, who's somebody you mentioned many, like several times over the course of the book, and often is like a foil for the way you're kind of looking at this. Who said that he like in the sort of first phase of his career, he was mostly interested in unpacking like Marx's theory of history, and he wasn't that interested in moral philosophy because he kind of vaguely assumed that the sort of injustice of capitalism or the preferability of socialism was sort of so obvious that like any halfway reasonable moral theory would give you that result. He said that he sort of engaging with like Robert Nozick libertarianism made him think, okay, this actually does need like a more robust defense, and then he got interested in moral philosophy. And so one difference between that and the kind of approach you've got there is the one you sort of already said, that you think that the sort of like substantive conclusions about morality are different. But the other difference, and one that I wanted to make sure that I explore right in this conversation, because I think it's like I mean that this is definitely an area where I have a different perspective, and I think it'd be interesting to explore. Is what you talk about right at the beginning of the book about analytical Marxism and the dialectical method, right? So
I get spooky right off the bat.
Yeah. So this is so I think that like if you think about so like the kind of Marxist theory that somebody like Cohen is doing, or you mentioned Eric Olnwright and a bunch of other people, right, is analytical Marxism, which roughly means taking the sort of typical methodology of, for example, analytic philosophy, or sort of social science research, or etc.
Right.
And sort of like exploring typically Marxist themes or arguing for typically Marxist conclusions using this methodology. So the sort of key difference, between that and I think what you're advocating as far as this part of your project goes, right, is this question about whether Marxism has like a distinctive method of like trying to figure out what's true, right? So there's this in Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, and this famous preface to the second edition, right? He says, we believe that although the word dialectical has not always been used without clear meaning, it has never been used with clear meaning to denote method rival to the analytical one. There's no such thing as a dialectical form of reasoning that can challenge analytical reasoning, and belief in it as a rival to analysis thrives only in an atmosphere of unclear thought, right? So that and then there's other stuff that people in the same tradition, like Eric Olnwright and a couple of co-authors in a book called Reconstructing Marxism, have written that kind of expands on that thought, right? It's but that seems like the sort of core of the disagreement, right? So I would say, right, and I want to hear what you think about this, right? But I would say that I think people often kind of hear that, and there's like a sort of jokey thing that Cohen says in that introduction about you use the phrase no bullshit Marxism,
right.
which is, obviously not gonna,
not complimentary.
Yes, sure, right. That's the like if you anybody who feels like they're doing what you would consider to be the other kind, right?
Right.
That's you're not gonna like that's not gonna be heartwarming. But I think a lot of people hear that as like the sort of part of traditional Marxism that's about dialectics is therefore being described as bullshit, right? And I do think that in that Cohen line we just looked at it, I do think there's like a little bit more nuance than that, right? Like I think that there's the thought as I would read it is, look, it's not like when Marx or subsequent Marxists might use this dialectical language, words like contradiction, to describe social processes. It's not like what they're saying is necessarily, always nonsensical or wrong, right? But that it doesn't add up to like a sort of different, distinctively Marxist way of like finding out the truth, besides just sort of thinking through arguments and the logical connections between premises and conclusions, and looking at the evidence for premises and all that stuff that you do, like that anybody would do, right? So I think that's the disagreement. And so clearly you're somebody who does think that there is like a distinct dialectical method, right? So I wanted to kind of give you a chance to sort of, I know this is a very big question, right? My knowledge,
but it is a sort of key one. Yeah.
So, like, I know this is a really broad question, but I mean, like, what's the, like, if you're thinking of this not just kind of as in the way that I think a lot of people in the analytical Marxist vein would, right? Like, God, we also grabbed that quote from Reconstructing Marxism, where Wright and his co-authors, say the skillful use of dialectical metaphors can serve worthwhile heuristic purposes, but it's one thing to be fluent in a suggestive idiom, and something else to display a distinctive methodology. And so say, okay, so they kind of go through, I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but like to go through different things that like contradiction, for example, can mean. Like, for example, that you might have a system that has two conditions for reproducing itself over time that can't be simultaneously fulfilled. And so, yeah, look, these can be like sort of useful things to be attuned to and point out. But then ultimately you have to sort of figure out like what the claim is, and then unpack that in terms of kind of conventional language about causes and effects and mechanisms and all that stuff. And so I wanted to get kind of like how you're seeing this, like why, I mean, I'm obviously somebody who's much more sympathetic to that sort of approach, but I mean, like you do say this right at the beginning of the book, like this is important. This is important to you, right? That you think that there is this distinctively dialectical methodology, right? So how would you kind of, I guess, elevator pitch what that methodology is?
Yeah, great. So I'll respond in sort of two parts. So one is a kind of like general observation about a distinction between, broadly speaking, a distinction between Marxist and let's say I want to
Sure.
say liberal, although I realize that's sort of question begging in the case of the analytical Marxists. Like, I think they're liberals, but I guess they didn't think they were liberal,
Sure.
But
So,
let's
look,
say
you can
Marxist,
use your terms in your own way, right?
right?
Like this is, so let's not get too hung up on that.
Yeah, so I take it. Let's say I take it anyway. That's certainly one point
Yeah.
of disagreement between Marx and
Yep.
I think myself on the one
Hmm.
hand, and then the analytical Marxists on the other hand, and not just them, but other people who have taken up Marx's ideas without his method, um, is a view about the role of method itself. So
Hmm.
not just a disagreement about which method to take up, but also a disagreement about the relationship of method to rational conclusions. So the analytical Marxists proceed from the assumption that Marx's conclusions can be derived from any method. If they're true, then any sort of good method, right, will get you there. And once they dismiss his dialectical method as bullshit, then the question is to sort of cast around for a non-shitty method in their view. And well, here are the methods of conceptual analysis, of rational choice theory, and so on. And if his conclusions are any good, if they're true, then they should be possible. It should be possible to derive them from these methods. And so the first thing to notice is that this is already a substantive disagreement with Marx, right? And with the sort of mainstream of the Marxist tradition as well. Marx is, of course, I mean, what are Marx's conclusions, after all, about the sort of about how human beings should ideally live? They're things like solidarity, human brotherhood. People should have enough to eat. You know who else thought that? Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, you sort of don't need to get to Marx, to sort of abstractly embrace and endorse those views. And I think that is to endorse them, I think, as mere ethical imperatives. And what is distinctive about Marx is not that he highlights a litany of mere ethical imperatives, but rather that he takes himself to have developed a method that demonstrates both the groundedness of those imperatives in already existing human history, so that they are not just, as he says, so that communism is not just an ideal to which reality must adjust itself, but an already existing movement overthrowing the existing state of things. And that shows how we can do it, how we can get there. That answers the question of how is it that we practically bridge what seems like an impassable gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. All of that for Marx is packed into this question of method. And the analytical Marxists tend to take it that method itself is relatively innocent and agnostic of these kind of deeper implications about the connections between the longed for end and the actually existing present. So that's one, I think, really important distinction between how they think about method. But as for Marx's method, I mean, one of the things that I also say in the intro, and that I do my best to demonstrate throughout the book, is that and so I made the joke about it being spooky or something, but one of the things I hope to demonstrate is that it's not that spooky, that actually it's quite continuous with the best methods of bourgeois science, right, and bourgeois inquiry, and that Marx himself, right, saw himself as incorporating, advancing, extending, and superseding what already in all sorts of already existing bourgeois science is a recognition of development, process, change, transformation, and of this occurring through conflicts, contradictions, and so on. When Marx and Engels read Darwin's Origin of Species, they were elated, and they commented to one another that this showed, in the case of natural science, mechanisms like those which they took to be operative in human science, right, in the science of understanding human development. Methodological holism, of course, is one of the things that the that Cohen in particular, and that the analytical Marxists in general reject. They instead embrace methodological individualism. They cash out the question of contradiction in ways like what you just demonstrated, where they tend to understand contradiction as just like two things that like don't fit together or something, right? Or two things that kind of are in tension. But for Marx, the point is that that tension can be understood as the development, that tension itself comes from somewhere. It has a history. It has a development. We can ask, when we think about what Marx has to say about class struggle, it's not just the bare fact of a capitalist class and a proletariat class. And then we say, oh, it's a contradiction. Why does he use this weird, why say it's Widerspruch? Why not say something else? It's just two things. It's just two groups that both want the same that are fighting over the same material resources. Why not just say that? Because what Marx is describing is a conflict, a contradiction that itself has a history and that develops out of human beings, again, interacting with their natural and social environment in order to satisfy their needs, such that when I look across the table at the boss, at the capitalist, and I think that I'm looking at this totally alien, hostile enemy, part of the lesson for Marx is that they exist in virtue of the labor, right, the work that human beings are doing, that working people are doing, that both our enemy and the contradiction, the struggle, the conflict between the worker and the boss has a history, and that its genesis can be understood as having been produced by human beings. And that is the piece that often goes really missing, I think, in a lot of the analytical Marxist analyses or attempts to make sense of Marx. The idea that this has a historical development, a processual character, and that at the end of the day, the key to understanding its contours, its origins, and the possibility of its abolition is that it is a human product. It is something that we have created through our attempts to survive. And those attempts have been largely unconscious, uncoordinated, but that the opportunity exists for us to have and develop an understanding of ourselves as a species, first of all, ourselves as a class, and ourselves as a species, so that we can relate to these apparent contradictions as conflicts that can be resolved through our own conscious self-activity. And I think those are the kinds of things that, as difficult as it can be at times, sometimes to kind of wrap our heads a little bit around dialectics, the way that Marx is understanding it and the way that he adapts it from Hegel. There's also all sorts of puzzles that I think remain puzzles if you don't understand all these factors of human social life as themselves being the products of human creative activity. That's the key of dialectics for Marx. Oh wait, I can't hear you. What's happening? Let's see. Oh, you're muted.
That's 100%
Okay.
my fault. I was just muted.
I panicked. I was like, oh
I
no.
think I was typing for a second, so I muted myself so I don't make clacking noises in the background. Yeah. So I think one thing that's interesting here is that, you know, the same way that Marx never puts out a book or even pamphlet or article on his ethical views, you know, he never puts out like a pamphlet on dialectical methodology. You know, he was too busy writing Heroes of the Exile. But yeah, but you know, so there too, you kind of have to like glean a little bit, right? You know, from Hegel, from what he does say. You know, I guess Engels and Anti-Düring, you know, like maybe comes closest, you know, to laying out at least how he understood a lot of that stuff. But, you know, if we're thinking about like, you know, so you said all this stuff about the contrast between how you know, like you think Marx is understanding contradiction, right? You know, and what you get out of the, you know, the analytical Marxist stuff. And you know, I think, you know, Cohen says little enough about it that, you know, it's like you can't, you know, it's like hard to evaluate because he just doesn't say very much about this. But, you know, certainly the Eric Olin Wright, Andrew Levine, Elliot Sober, you know, the Reconstructing Marxism, you know, they lay out a few pretty specific things the contradiction could mean. And I want to push on this point just a little bit because I want to kind of see like, you know, the kind of some of the critique that you just gave, right? You know, that's like, okay, well, it's important for understanding how you know Marx is using the word contradiction, that these are things that have a history that like came, you know, that like unfolded out of previous contradictions and all that stuff. So if you think about the kind of thing they say about what counts as about how to understand this word contradiction, right? They say one way of explicating this concept of conventional causal language is to treat a contradiction as a situation in which there are multiple conditions for the reproduction of a system, which cannot all be simultaneously satisfied. Alternatively, a contradiction can be viewed as a situation in which the unintended consequences of a strategy subvert the accomplishment of its intended goals. Or finally, a contradiction can be viewed as an underlying social antagonism that produces conflict. If a social relation has certain properties which have an intrinsic tendency to generate conflict, one might say that the conflict is generated by a contradiction. There may be advantages or disadvantages to each of these formulations. In these cases, however, contradiction is not treated as a philosophically driven way of interpreting the essence of a process, but as a way of explicating the interactions among a set of causal mechanisms. So the reason, you know, I wanted to go back to that quote and kind of spell it out is it's certainly not obvious to me, at least, why, like, okay, like take like the first of the explications of contradiction they offer there, right? That is, you have a situation where there are multiple conditions for the reproduction of a system that can't all be simultaneously satisfied. It's not obvious to me what about that sort of suggests that this is something that exists without itself coming from a historical trajectory of development, you know, like anything like that, right? Like
it strikes me as inherently positivistic.
Okay, what is that? Okay,
yeah, because actually that claim, I mean, so what you said in defense is it could have a history. Of course it could, right? But what they say there is that to be a contradiction is just to have I forget exactly the exact formulation, but to have like conditions of the reproduction of a society that can't be simultaneously satisfied. That's just a description.
Sure.
That's just cataloging an appearance, right? That's not what I mean. That is not doesn't get to the heart of what I mean. So
Yeah.
It doesn't get to the heart of what Marx means by a contradiction. Now, importantly, they don't mean it to. They're trying to take what they regard as the unacceptably metaphysically laden conceptual language of Marx and translate it into something that is sensible in the terms of analytical philosophy. And they do a pretty good job, but I think it's really important to note that while, as you say, you could say that first sentence and also make some claims about the necessarily historical character of the contradiction, they don't. And they don't, in part because in order to do that, you would, I think, in order to do so consistently, you would have to subscribe to a methodological holism. You would have to be developing some kind of sense of the totality that allows you to make a claim about the satisfiability of those conditions and the possibility of them being conditioned at once, and the absence of some third possibility of reconciling them in some other way that is out there, right? But if you don't think that you actually have the possibility to think about being as a totality, then maybe that contradiction can be resolved in all sorts of ways. Maybe there's something out there that can help, right?
Well,
So let me put this in a different way, because I think it's actually connected to a kind of a general skepticism. I mean, so sometimes the hostility to Marx's method is put as a skepticism about, like, those damn communists. They think they know everything, but you don't. Anything could happen, right? And you see this in some of John Stuart Mill's. Now, I know these are not millions per se, but you see it in some of John Stuart Mill's criticisms of the communists, because he says they think that the only two possibilities for the future are communism or destruction or absolute disaster. And he's like, they don't know that. So anything could happen. But who says that capitalism can't go on like this forever? That conception of contradiction as like just two kind of mutually irreconcilable, I don't have the thing in front of me, right? But that there's,
if you want it, here's the
multiple conditions for the reproduction of a system cannot all be simultaneously satisfied. That admits of a range of ways to address the contradiction. So Marx thinks that, Marx, partially because of the fact that he's thinking about totality and he's thinking in a methodologically holist way, part of what he thinks is that he has exhausted the range of possibilities, right? That the answer to the contradiction is, as he says in those first lines of the Communist Manifesto, either that one side of the contradiction is triumphant, right, and abolishes the contradiction between itself and its antagonist, or that the contradiction leads to a destruction, right, to the degradation of the system as a whole. But that description, which is just a kind of, as I say, there's something positivist about it. It just describes an appearance. Lots of things could potentially ameliorate the fact that there's various. Right. I mean, but let me put it this way. It's no accident that most of these people gave up on the Marxism.
Well,
it's no accident, I think.
I would point out that
rights holding on. Yeah, right.
I would point out that, I mean, I think the extent to which, different people in this tradition, did give up or not, is a little bit complicated. But I'd also point out that it's like, look, at the same time period, tons of Marxists with very different methodologies, moved often in very ideologically parallel directions, right? Like that. This is, I think that, I think there are broader historical currents there, but I would just point out, like, on the like sticking to the point you just made about contradictions.
Yeah.
that you can say it's like, okay, well, if you think, what a contradiction is or what it maybe means in some contexts, I tend to think that in in different contexts, I think Marx often uses these terms in slightly different ways, but if you think that's what it means, then you can say, okay, well, we can say that there is a contradiction, like if Marx is talking about, like a contradiction of capitalism, they think it's going to lead to the downfall of capitalism, and you understand it in that first sense. Well, whether that result is inevitable or not, even if you think that's a separate question from like what contradiction means, right? I would point out that in fact, like J. Cohen's, the guy we started out talking about, has his most famous book maybe is a defense of a version of historical materialism that's in fact often criticized on kind of the opposite grounds from what you were saying about Mill, right? As being like way too deterministic, right? Like that's if anything kind of the usual critique of that, right? So you could say that, like, okay, here's what a contradiction means if the whether this contradiction was it arising in the first place is historically inevitable, and whether it's in some sense what that means. And I think you actually have some pretty like nuanced things to say in the book about the sense in which things might or might not actually be historically inevitable. You talk about the sort of interplay between freedom and determinism, and your kind of view about Marx as a theory of history. But like, even if you could even have very strong views about inevitability and say it's like, look, we're not going to glean that from the definition of contradiction, but like that's a substantive claim that has to be argued for, right? But you could argue, but like it seems to me that the definition doesn't settle that. One way or the other.
Well, right? That one doesn't.
Yeah. No, well, certainly, right?
But yeah.
Like, if you do think, like, so why is it? I guess here's. Can
I just quickly clarify the inevitability? I don't mean to cut you off, but I think this will potentially help. Just like drill down on what it is that we maybe disagree about. Who even knows? The inevitability is not, for example, that communism must necessarily be at the other end of the rainbow, right? Or
either communism is at the other end of the rainbow, or you
that is the inevitability,
barbarism or something, or have some kind of catastrophic social collapse. Right?
That's the inevitability, and that is one that I think. For Marx is situated within an understanding of contradiction. So another way to put this, I say, I forget which chapter this is. Sorry, this went from a very short. This one from me being like, I have a short thing too.
It's okay. I like
it. But I think this will help because there's also a place in the book, I think it's in one of the later chapters, where I say that part of what makes it possible for humanity to know itself is the heightening of these contradictions under capitalism, precisely because it draws all of humanity into one single conflict and makes it more available to be understood as a single system with a process of internal historical development. And that this is what produces the possibility that Marx is availing himself of making these claims about these universal claims about humanity and of how human history develops. That, I take it, is all baked in, part and parcel, married to, connected with a particular understanding of contradiction, which again is connected to the methodological holism, and which absolutely does make it the case that which actually is connected to the inevitability of either this contradiction understood, which is a description of a certain kind of antagonism, mutual antagonism into which all of humanity is drawn, right? Which is heightened to a point where either one side of that contradiction wins out or you have the mutual destruction. But I think that's the kind of thing I have in mind that is, I think, made more possible to formulate using Marx's dialectical method and his and using dialectics, right, and thinking about things in terms of this historically developed contradiction of a unity, because like it's important for Marx, the contradiction is the internal contradiction of a unity. For the characterizations on there, that's not necessary, right? That's not sort of baked into the understanding of a contradiction. If what you think of as a contradiction is just two things that are at loggerheads, there's only so much analytical work you can get out of that. But Marx understands it as a unity with an internal mutual antagonism that conditions its development. And that's the piece that I think without it, it's difficult to make sense of much of. It's certainly difficult to make sense of his revolutionary politics. And I think, I mean, whatever, maybe this like totally, this is my suspicion. This is my suspicion, let's say, that it's no accident, right? That there's a kind of, and it's not just the analytical Marxists. You saw it with Bernstein, the debates that Bernstein and Luxemburg were having 100 years ago, devolved on precisely this question, right? And then it was not an accident that one of those people had a consistent revolutionary politics and one of them didn't. There's a real connection, I think, between method and political conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the question is, right, like, let's say for the sake of argument that that like any definition of what a contradiction is that doesn't bake in the historical origin is a bad definition. Then, like, all right, so let's say we've got that. I mean, I think that we could we've got like everything you want, right? In the
and totality.
Sure. Why not? Everything must go. Right? So then I guess the question is, when you say this is like a method, right? Like this, so this is that this is a way of figuring out what's true, right? Other than sort of conventional ways of figuring out what's true. That's like what's the what's the method, right? How is it how is this, like, I mean, because so far, right, this sounds a lot like just like a substantive claim, right, a conclusion, right, that this is that society is development of society has to do with the unfolding of contradictions, which we have to understand in a way that where we think it's not a separate question, right? How they operate right now, where they come from. But it's like, okay, well, that's a conclusion, right? We can argue about whether that's true, right? But in what sense does that add up to to a separate method for discovering what's true about all of this?
Yeah, I think there's two. Well, there's probably many places to look, but two that I'll mention. So we have Marx's and Engels' statements that I referenced just briefly before at the beginning of the critique of the German ideology, where they're distinguishing their theoretical method from what they see as the methods of German idealism and the sort of milieu that they're in. And they say, as we all know, of course, they say that the premises of their method are human beings, right, interacting with the world in order to satisfy their needs. So I think that's one piece. At least I can say, I guess the only way I can answer this question is to tell you what I do is to tell you what I do in my attempt, to take up their method. And one is a kind of you might reasonably call it, I guess, a methodological assumption, but to look at things and to ask the question, how is it that this aspect of human social being is a result of human activity, of our own creative activity? So that rules out certain kinds of explanations, like looking at human beings are selfish. I can tell because look at them, they're mean, right? And instead understanding that as a particular kind of appearance, a particular kind of social manifestation, that in order to answer the question, why does that appearance exist, we can't just naturalize it. We have to understand how it is that human beings are producing a world in which that appearance is predominates, to the extent that it does. And the other place that I'll mention is his second thesis on Feuerbach, where Marx says that the this-sidedness of, he says that the sort of metaphysical questions about matter and ideas as kind of like metaphysical substance, that these are purely scholastic when they're separated from practice. And he says that the this-sidedness of our thinking has to be demonstrated through practice. And so the most important aspect of Marx's method is to be a revolutionary, to attempt to transform the world, to actually attempt to navigate and resolve those contradictions, to actually try to bring about the reconciliation of the appearance of human life with the essential nature of human beings as a species, and to observe that, to notice that contradiction that we've just described, especially in capitalism, the heightened contradiction of capitalists with laborer, and to take a side. And to take the side of the masses of society on the basis that is the side that is most likely to preserve to achieve the sort of Aufhebung, right, of this contradiction, to preserve humanity rather than advance its destruction, right, and to resolve that contradiction in favor of one side, the side of the working class, which is also the side of humanity. And so the method is to be a revolutionary, to try to bring about the resolution of that contradiction in a manner that preserves human history and development, and to correct our understandings of the world and of humanity as we, through our revolutionary practice, learn things about how it is that human history unfolds and how we can actively intervene into it so as to bring about our continued survival. That's the revolution is the method.
Okay. Well, I think that for this discussion, and I do hope that this is not your only appearance on the show, by the way. They have a for because you've mentioned methodological holism a bunch of times, and I do really want to get into that, but I think I also understand that there's probably like subjecting the audience to more than half an hour at a time of method.
Although, you know what, Ben, this is the first conversation I've had about the book, where we've gotten into
Ugh.
deep in the weeds of method. And actually, I've been thinking to myself, there are people out there who are probably eating this up, because it really is important stuff. I think I love that you're asking these questions, because in a way, I mean, there's a sense in which this is the main intervention of the book, is to right. And so, I mean, it runs through the entire argument, is to try to show that you got to be a revolutionary if you want to understand the world. That's what Marx thought, and that's what I think. And so I don't know, I think it's great that we've gotten into this.
Fair enough. Well, good. So I do want to, but before we're done though, I do want to get into like a little bit of the specifics about conclusions, right? I mean, I don't want to leave people hanging on that, although again, read the book. But so you spend a fair amount of the book talking about, the difference between how you think, like your reading of Marx, and that you're endorsing, right? How that's different from the way that other, ethical visions, see things. So you've got a chapter on Marx and Kant. You've got Marx and utilitarianism. There's Marx and Christianity, and I know we're not going to be able to do justice to all of those, right? Because you spend. You do go into pretty great depth about all of this, and like in the utilitarianism chapter, there's a whole riff on Marx and Bentham, and then there's like a whole different thing on Marx and Mill, and it's covering not just the sort of like Mill's kind of core writings about utilitarianism as a moral theory, but like also Mill's writings about political economy and and Marx's critique of that. But I do want to give people at least like a flavor of what's going on in these chapters, right? So because earlier you kind of said like, okay, one way, one reason why, in fact, you think that the methodological discussion is so important is that, if you're sort of, particularly if you're thinking about the normative side of things, because it's like, okay, one thing to say, Marx obviously has like a lot of, really distinctive things to say about how, modes of production rise and fall over the course of history, and how they, give rise to, legal and political systems and all that stuff. But, but like, if you're just kind of thinking about sort of conclusions, the sort of like bare bones normative ideals, then, you kind of said something jokey earlier about like, look, I mean, if all you want is solidarity and, brotherhood, and like, you already got that in Jesus, right?
Right. We're done.
What do you need Marx for? So maybe that'd be an interesting one to touch on, right? Because you do have a chapter on Marx and Christian ethics.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so I start, or I think it's in the introduction to the whole chapter, which is a survey of Marx on rival moral theories, and I talk about how sort of Christian metaphysics, it actually does embrace what Marx thinks, which is that the world is in constant change and dynamism, right? That there's all sorts of impermanence. But it just regards that impermanence as suspect, right? And as obviously not the sort of thing that could be real or true. And God is real and true in part because he's permanent, eternal, unchanging, and so on. So there's this interesting kind of agreement, on the sort of terms of the debate, and then just picking the other side. Marx so one of the things that I do in that section on Marx and Christian morality is I actually engage with Marx's extended literary criticism of a French novel called The Mysteries of Paris, by an author, Eugene Sue. And there's very little, at least in English, there's very little other engagements with Marx on this novel. But Marx is sort of tracing the story of the main character of this novel, whose name is Marie. And at every turn, the more that she is the more that she abstains from worldly pleasures, the more that she sequesters herself, the more that she denies herself, and the more that she sacrifices for God, the more holy she is. And Marx thinks, gross, basically. Like Marx reads this and he just thinks this is completely perverse. And it's one of the places where I think he's most clear in what I also describe elsewhere in the book as this real unstinting hostility to sacrifice as an ethical value. The idea that somehow the highest value, the highest ethical act for a human being is to deny themselves and is to sacrifice their interests. I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find something that Marx finds more disgusting, actually. And this also connects up with some of his criticisms of and engagements of liberalism and what we might call a liberal morality. The notion that there's a kind of irreconcilable conflict between what is in the interest of the individual person and what is for the greater good, or what is good to do, or what the human being ought to do. I think Marx finds insensible on two separate grounds. One of them is he just thinks it's a bad plan. He thinks that if you're expecting to resolve ethical problems by relying on the by people to have this absolutely sacrificial attitude towards their own interests, he just thinks that can only remain a kind of ethical an ethical demand, right? It can never be an actual strategy for producing an ethical world, right? For producing a world in which human beings can flourish.
All right. Well, with any luck, we will have Vanessa back. There we go. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I got a little flash that was like, something happened on our end. Try again. So I tried again and now I'm back. So I think he thinks it's problematic on that basis. And I think he just thinks it's like, got something wrong about the relationship between, I think that he thinks that there's something very human hating about it. And as a humanist, he's not into it. Marx writes that man is the highest being for man. And I think that's something that he thinks all throughout his corpus, that it is the thing that we ought to do is actually try as deeply as possible to inhabit a human perspective, not to abandon it and not to subordinate it to anything else. And that in adopting a radically human perspective and in endorsing our interests as a human species, that is a good thing, that is exactly the sort of thing that can bring about those ideals of solidarity, of brotherhood, of um, of of creating those circumstances conducive to our flourishing, of this statement that he makes in the comment on James Mill about what it would be like to produce for one another in an unalienated way, to see you as a human being and respond to you as a human being, which is to say, to just have an immediate concern for you. Mm-hmm. That's what Marx wants, and I think he is convinced, right, that that a Christian morality militates against that. Now, as I say elsewhere in the book, that doesn't mean that there's not a long history of Christian activists in the socialist tradition who have cared a lot about and sacrificed a lot for the interests of human beings and wanted human beings to flourish and to live well. But I do think this is his critique of Christianity as a religious doctrine.
Right. Yeah. So, and I'm thinking, like, at least as you present it in the book, the critique of Kant is going to be like parallel to this in some ways, right? You know, that you know, and I mean, I'm just, you know, kind of trying to figure this out, because as I said at the beginning, you know, I kind of knew coming into this we were probably going to get to like a fraction of what's
oh my gosh, yeah,
of what's, you know, what was prepared, and, you know, never mind what's in the book.
Yeah,
right? You know?
we would need a podcast, another whole show that is just going through every.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if you want to do a round two, we can do methodological holism, and also some of the stuff about John Stuart Mill that I thought was really interesting. That's in the book, that, you know, which, you know, because you had you mentioned this whole thing about Marx's criticism of Mill on political economy, and you know, and just like, it just like kind of fortuitously worked out at the end of my like capital class. We like just did that like passage. So
oh,
like,
that's so great.
You know, I've got takes, right? You know, I want to talk about it, but like that might have to save that. You know, save the
happy to get into that. Yeah,
the Mill and the methodological holism for next time. But like but you know, just for the sake of kind of like wrapping up, you know, this discussion and giving people, you know, some sense of this, because like, you know, just maybe to kind of try to tie together a couple threads of what you've been talking about as we like finish up the discussion for today. You know, you mentioned Bernstein earlier, and when you were talking about methodology, and certainly just, you know, just kind of going back to the like original, like the thing about the project, right? You know, say, all right, when people, you know, if your starting point, right, like if the sort of shared starting point of a lot of this is, all right, you know, Marxism is important because it's going to tell us something that's like, you know, analytically, that's, you know, that's factually, you know, going to be informative about how the world works, why things have, you know, why the invasion of Iraq happened, right? You know, in 2003, for example,
right.
And we certainly care about that a lot, right? But it's also pretty natural, right? You know, to care, as you said, about why it was immoral to invade Iraq, and you know, and if, you know, you're reading Capital, and, you know, Marx is telling you all of this stuff about, you know, child labor in factories, it's like, okay, you know, it's certainly interesting and important to kind of get the story that he's telling about how the development of factory machinery and all that changed capitalist incentives in ways that led to the introduction of child labor in factories. But there is still this question of like, okay, we certainly have this strong feeling that child labor is wrong. Why is it wrong? Right?
Right.
And so when people are like kind of looking at all that and they say, all right, so if there's obviously some sort of really strong moral impulse here, and we're kind of looking for a place to plug it in, right? To say like, okay, here's my moral theory that's going to explain why I feel the way I do about the factual stuff going on here. A lot of people, as you know, right, kind of Edward Bernstein through Cornel West and many more, right, have said Kant, right? Like that's what we're going to plug in here, right? What we need is like the synthesis of Kantianism and Marxism. So as far as like kind of extant rivals to like your view about this, right? I mean that's one that I feel like if we're just going to like pick one last one to talk about,
right? Yeah.
Wrap up the episode, it should probably be that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a kind of two-pronged approach to the question of Kant-Marx synthesis in my book. So I on the one hand argue that well, first of all, the whole book is an argument that Marx don't need nobody, like that it's there, right? That what we want out of a theoretical appraisal of the circumstances in which we find ourselves is there. So in one way, the whole book is an argument against the notion that we need to appeal to some other external moral theory in order to get moral content. So that's there. And then of course I go into more detail about that in the Kant chapter. As you mentioned, I talk about the debates that happened in the Second International between Bernstein and Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg. So Kant famously, as we all know, right, has a moral theory that is centered on the notion of the spontaneous free will. And that is absolutely alien to Marx's worldview. There's no place for it. His historical materialism is completely incompatible with the idea that there exists some ideal or spiritual or conceptual, completely immaterial self or piece of a self or aspect, whatever you want to call it, right? Some kind of willing subject that is purely ideal in character and that is undetermined by the material world. There's no place for that in Marx's view. And if you endorse it, then you have to be abandoning what I think are some important and essential methodological features of his view. And so what I argue is that I do not think these are compatible. I think that's okay, because I don't think that we need Kantianism in order to get the thing that the addition of Kantianism is supposed to give you. But I also, interestingly, part of what I do in that chapter is, there are Kantians who are like, Marxists, we're just trying to help you out. Like, we want to be with you, but you guys need a moral theory, and we've got one, and it's pretty good, which is I actually think is a totally reasonable approach. But the problem is that if they're right, if it really is true that Marxist theory is incoherent without the contribution of Kantian morality, that would actually be so much the worse for Marxism, because it cannot be reconciled with the key aspect of Kant's ethics, and that's even true. So there's also an argument to be made that the most coherent presentation of Kant's moral theory doesn't exist in his expressly moral philosophy, but appears elsewhere in his political writings. And I think that is actually true, that there's that there you do get more of a sense of Kant thinking that the world has to be organized in a particular way in order for people to engage in moral reasoning reliably. So you do get, I think, a better, more full picture, and one that might be more easily made compatible with Marx. But even there, you still get that Kant is relying on the notion of the spontaneous free will, and there's no way, you cannot square that with Marx. There's no way. So I just think it's a dead end, and if heaven forbid it's true that Marxism is dead in the water without it, then that's a big problem. But I don't think that that's actually a resource that we can help ourselves to or need to happily.
Yeah. So I mean, and on this question about spontaneous free will, you actually, I should say, right, for that anybody who heard that as sort of kind of straightforward denial of free will in any sense, that you have a lot to say about this in the book. You've got this whole thing about dialectical compatibilism, right? Between free will and determinism.
Or I would say freedom, because free will, I want to, I mean, there's different things you can mean by free will. I think you could plausibly, I think the way that you're glossing free will is totally plausible. But in the book, I keep that notion to mean just the spontaneous free will, the kind of thing Kant has in view, and then I refer to freedom, right? Where freedom is, I think, in a lineage more with Hegel, with Aristotle, the kind of like full flourishing expression of our nature.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess you did seem to me to be like relating those questions, right? So there's like, because when you say it the way you just said it, right? Like that sort of presents it as like what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom at this point is this kind of like normative goal of letting people flourish in the whatever stuff Marx always says, full play of their physical and mental powers and all that stuff, right? And of course, sure, that's very important, right? But then you do also seem at points in the book to be presenting this as having something to do with freedom, in the sense that seems to be invoked when, for example, people argue about how rigidly deterministic Marx's theory of history is, or like when you think about like what Marx means when he says famously in the 18th Brumaire, right, men make their own history, even if they don't make it under circumstances of their own choosing. So I think that like how much ultimately this is going to have to do with your point about Kantian ethics, I'm less sure, right? But I mean, I think that part of the thing there is, as you say, there are different things that somebody could mean by free will, right? So the question is, do you, to kind of make sense of some Kantian or Kantianish moral view, do you need this kind of free will that's so radical that we can't make sense of it, within the terms of the phenomenal world, right? That's and that's a big question, just about Kant, right? Like about how
that's right.
Yeah.
But that's a really interesting way to frame it. And I think a helpful one. Yeah. And and in the book I argue that you do. I mean, I actually, I think it's because as I say, like, there is this argument to be made, like, well, he's a little bit more materialist-y in some of his other, but I think when the hammer comes down, when it comes down to it, but you're absolutely right, and I really like the way that you're framing it. But you're right. If you could somehow tell a story where Kant doesn't rely on that fully spontaneous free will, then you might have a more plausible way of kind of squaring these things. I think there might be other sources of tension, but I do see that as the main one. But I address this sort of set of questions in the book, and you I think already articulated this quite clearly, that the bugaboo is strict determinism, right? Is the notion that somehow the fact that human beings are shaped by their external circumstances is somehow taken to be absolutely fatal to the possibility of them being anything other than cogs in a machine. That somehow that is incompatible with the notion of genuine human agency. And that is the sort of main way that I'm cashing out that question of dialectical compatibilism, for instance, as a story about human agency as something that is produced over time, that flourishes in some circumstances and not in others. And then the question for us now under capitalism is to take up actively and consciously the aim of developing our agency even further, so that more and more the things that we do and the way that we interact with the world and the way that we appear is the result of our desires, our preferences, who we are as people, what it is that makes us unique. I say at one point that there's a freedom chapter and an individuality chapter, and I see those as telling the same story in different keys, basically. Is one way you could put it. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Vanessa, well, can I get you back for a round two so we can do?
Happily. Yeah, this has been fantastic.
Methodological holism and John Stuart Mill and a bunch of the other stuff that we didn't talk about today.
Absolutely. This was a lot of fun, and as I say, like we got into some areas of the book that I haven't had an opportunity to talk about in this kind of format. So this is really great, and I really hope that those who get an opportunity to listen to this find it helpful to sort of further illuminating some of the implications of the book, and I hope they read the book.
Yes, there is a link down below the box where you're watching us where you can order the book, and I'm sure you can get it at all the usual book places. I think we've got the direct publisher link in the description for the episode. But yeah,
thank you, Ender.
Yeah, I also had I didn't put it on the screen earlier, but there was a Sam Badger, who is a viewer who I happen to know, wrote a doctoral dissertation on Marx and morality. Was earlier when I was finally transitioning away from the method talk, was saying in the chat, I want to listen to method.
Right. I knew it. I said, Ben, it's going to be the Marx nerd contingent is like, let's do this.
Well, if there's if there's going to be a podcast to serve that contingent, it's got to be this one.
It's this one.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.